Hello and welcome to the Promotion and Relegation Show. We are advancing to week 14 and all but the Tier 2 conferences will wrap up their seasons this week. We have already seen some teams earn their promotion to the next level and others that have clinched their divisions. We also can't forget about the team that has already earned relegation from the top tiers as well. So, without further ado, let's get right into it and start with the tier that starts all the movement in Tier 4 with the Independent Conference. We already know that Colorado State is the team that will be promoted to the Conference USA in Tier 3, but we now know that they will be the outright champions after Old Dominion lost this week. Colorado State is going to finish the season with 5 independent points after facing a very difficult schedule, playing half their games against top 2 tier talent and making the most of those opportunities, going 4-2 in those games. So now let's transition to Tier 3 conferences and the battles that we have going on in this tier in the Conference USA and the Sun Belt. We're going to start with the Conference USA and the Central Division. The battle for the top happened this week with Northern Illinois and Rice playing against each other, and the winner of that battle would be Northern Illinois. This means that Northern Illinois are going to be the champions of the Central Division in Tier 3 and will have the opportunity to play for promotion at the end of the season. They await the winner of the West Division, and that is going to be Utah State. Utah State beat UNLV in overtime this week, which will secure their spot at the top of the West Division after they have already beaten both Air Force and Rapid City. Both Utah State and Northern Illinois now will play against each other in 3 weeks in the Conference Championship Week. Now, moving on to the relegation, we know because Colorado State has already clinched promotion that the relegated team will be coming from the West. With the loss to Utah State, UNLV are going to be the team that will be relegated to the Independent Conference and Tier 4, having already lost to their rival, Nevada. That will wrap up the Conference USA, and we will now move on to the Sun Belt Conference. In the Northwest, Temple still owns their division with an undefeated record in conference and still await who will win the other division, which will now move us on to the Southeast Division. We have a few teams that are competing for that top spot in the division. Virginia beat South Alabama, which is going to put them at the top of the division for now. But that is only going to be for right now. Western Kentucky is only a half game back and owns the tiebreaker over them. And speaking on Western Kentucky, they beat Georgia State this week, which will still keep them in the running for that division title. They will try and do that this week as they will be playing newcomer to the Sun Belt, South Alabama. If Western Kentucky were to win this week, that would make them the division winners with their tie-breaking win over Virginia earlier in the season. However, if Western Kentucky were to lose this week, that would put Virginia at the top of the division. Temple would love nothing more than that. If that were to happen, that would make Temple the team that will be promoted out of the Sun Belt because Virginia are ineligible for promotion this season after they got relegated last year. As a reminder, a team is not eligible for promotion immediately following the year they were relegated. They would still have the opportunity to win the conference, but that will not result in them moving forward. So this game next week between Western Kentucky and South Alabama means a lot for all the teams that will be involved in Tier 3 and even the teams involved in Tier 2. And speaking of those Tier 2 conferences, we will now move on to them, where most of all the teams have 2 games to go and everything still to play for. We're going to start out west with the Mountain West Conference. The battle for promotion is now down to only 3 teams: the University of Alaska, Washington State, and Kansas. The University of Alaska are going to be finishing off their season against the other top teams in the conference, with Kansas and Washington State. These are all going to be huge games, as they could allow them to control their own destiny up to the Pac and Tier 1. This could also have huge ramifications for the rankings, as well, as they're sitting as a top 5 team in the country and are fighting for the ability to play in the national championship game. Washington State only have their 1 game left, and as mentioned previously, it's going to be against the University of Alaska. They just lost to Kansas this week, which puts them in the 3rd spot amongst these final teams, and will need to beat Alaska to stay realistically in the running for promotion. Kansas will finish their season playing against Alaska and California, and could very well be playing for promotion this week against Alaska. They already have their win over Washington State and could very well assure top spot with a win over Alaska. This week could be a decider for promotion to the top flights of the NCAA. And now looking at the teams that are fighting to stay out of the relegation spot for the Mountain West, Fresno State and San Diego State are the teams that could find themselves in that spot. Stanford is safe with their 2 wins because those 2 wins were against Fresno State and San Diego State. Fresno State and San Diego State will play each other this week, which will mean at best one of them would only finish with 2 wins. Stanford owns the tiebreaker over both of them, which means the game this week between Fresno State and San Diego State will decide who is going to be in the relegation spot and await the conference champion of the Conference USA. San Diego State had a chance to try and keep themselves safe, but lost last week to Billings on one of the last plays of the game. This game this week will be massive for both Fresno State and San Diego State. So now we're going to be talking about the Central region in the Tier 2 conferences, being the ever-competitive Big Ten. The top of the conference is stacked with competitiveness, with the only eligible teams for promotion being Tulane, Wisconsin, and UTEP. Nebraska does have a shot at winning the conference, but are ineligible for promotion due to being relegated last year. Wisconsin and UTEP were here last year, but just missed out on the promotion to Joplin. UTEP just narrowly missed out on the promotion last year, even more so than Wisconsin, because of their big loss being to Joplin late in the season. They are again one of the leaders of the conference with wins over both Wisconsin and Tulane. However, with their loss to Texas Tech this week, they are no longer in control of their destiny and have to have Wisconsin and Tulane lose at least one more time to hold the top spot. This is very reminiscent of last year when they lost to Joplin late and took themselves out of the control position. They do have a light schedule to finish the year with UTSA and Tulsa, who are both trying to stay out of the relegation zone. So now moving on to the top teams in the conference with Tulane and Wisconsin. They both will face off against each other this week for total control of the conference. Even though their one loss was to UTEP, they both can control their own destiny to the top, but will have to win both games in week 14 and 15 to stay at that top, as long as UTEP continues to win. After this week, Tulane finishes with Iowa, a relegation battle team, and Wisconsin will finish with Minnesota, also a team that is in the relegation battle. These next 2 weeks will be exciting to see who finishes on top, but you wouldn't really expect anything less from the uber competitive Big Ten. And now we get to talk about who could be finishing at the bottom of the conference, which is also super competitive. The team that could finish at the bottom are Iowa, UTSA, Tulsa, and Minnesota. So we're going to start this relegation battle by first talking about Minnesota. They are one of the safer teams when it comes to finishing at the bottom. Their 2 wins were against Iowa and UTSA. They're going to finish their season against the other bottom team, Tulsa, and then they'll finish with Wisconsin. A win against Tulsa will keep them safe, putting them safely out of range with 3 wins. But from there, it is wide open. Iowa, UTSA, and Tulsa have already all played each other, and each came away with a win and a loss. Iowa beat Tulsa, UTSA beat Iowa, and Tulsa beat UTSA. This puts them squarely in a tie for the bottom right now. 1 win could go a long way for either team's safety. Iowa has the hardest finishing schedule of the 3, with Nebraska and Tulane. All top teams in the conference and playing for the conference title. UTSA will finish with UTEP and Texas Tech. And finally, Tulsa will be finishing with Minnesota as well as UTEP. Currently, Iowa is in the most danger, sitting in the bottom of the 3 and finishing with the harder schedule of the 3. They have everything to play for in the next 2 weeks in this conference, which always makes the final weeks of the season all that more enjoyable. So now we will go to the Southeast region and look at the Tier 2 American Conference. There are 3 teams that have a good shot at promotion. Those are Wake Forest, UAB, and South Carolina. NC State has a shot at finishing at the top of the conference, but because they were relegated last year, they are ineligible for promotion. Wake Forest is the only eligible team that will play this week and really controls their own destiny. Their only loss is to South Carolina, who also has a shot at being promoted. Wake Forest has a fairly easy finish to their season, playing against bottom feeders Memphis and Duke. Week 15 will be intriguing though, with big games being played. UAB will be facing NC State in a battle of the top teams, and then South Carolina will finish against Mississippi State. There will be huge games in week 15, no matter what, even if Wake Forest were to lose this week. So now looking at the battle to avoid the relegation spot. The teams that are in the running for that spot are Virginia Tech, Memphis, and Duke. Neither team has an easy schedule to finish the season, so Duke is still in the running for the relegation spot because they have lost to Memphis, keeping them in a tie-breaking scenario if that ever comes to it. They are going to be finishing with Wake Forest in week 15. A win or a Virginia Tech loss will keep them safe. Memphis is in the most danger of being put in the relegation spot due to their loss to Virginia Tech earlier in the year. They still have 2 games to go and will finish with Wake Forest and East Carolina. And lastly, Virginia Tech is still in danger, but are safer due to their singular conference win coming against Memphis. They only have the 1 game left in week 15, which will be up against Kentucky. Every game will be huge for these bottom teams this week, and even more important in week 15 for the bottom and the top teams. Week 15 is going to be exciting for these 2 conferences, the Big Ten and the American Conference. And that will move us on to the last conference in Tier 2, being the MAC. Miami, Ohio beat Western Michigan this week, which will now guarantee them being promoted to Tier 1 and the ACC. They have had a great season so far, being undefeated in conference and already earning that promotion. And now looking at what looks like to be a crazy bottom of the conference, with so many teams being 3-4 in their conference record. However, the teams that are The most likely to finish in the relegation spot are Eastern Michigan and Army. Army only has the one game left in conference, which will be played this week against Indiana. But most importantly for Eastern Michigan, their one win in conference was against Army, losing to all the other 3 and 4 teams in the conference. They are going to be finishing with Miami, Ohio, and Western Michigan, the first place team and the second place team. They will need to win both of these games to stay alive. One loss or an Army win will guarantee their spot at the bottom of the conference and in that relegation spot, which is not really a position that anybody wants to be in, but very much so this year with the possibility of Temple getting that automatic promotion if Virginia were to win their division. So now we get to transition to the Tier 1 conferences that will be finishing up their conference seasons this week. We will start Tier 1 in the West with the Pacific Conference. This conference has already settled their division champions and their team that would be relegated last week, with Oregon and USC winning their divisions just like last year, and BYU was the team that was relegated. So now we get to move on to the Central region in the Big 12. SMU, who hasn't won a conference game this year, added to that by losing last week to Joplin. They will end up being the team that will be relegated this year after Houston pulled off their upset against Texas. SMU has also lost to TCU earlier in the year in overtime, which guarantees they will be relegated to Tier 2 and the Big 10. So now looking at the division leaders. Oklahoma has already won their division and are awaiting what will happen between Texas A&M, Oklahoma State, and Texas. Texas's loss to Houston last week really hurts them, trying to repeat as division champions, putting them at 5-3. Texas will finish their season against Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State fell from their top spot from last week after they lost to Texas A&M, which puts the Aggies into that first place spot. All Texas A&M have to do is beat Missouri this week, and they will be the division champions and face Oklahoma. For Oklahoma State to win the division, they will need to beat Texas this week and have Texas A&M lose. For Texas to be able to win the division, they will need to win this week and have Texas A&M lose, because they have already beaten Texas A&M this season. These are some huge games this week for those 3 teams. So now we will move to the SEC and look at their relegation battle and division battles. UCF faced a really good Miami team last week and will end up losing that one, which will have them be the team that is relegated out of the SEC and into the Tier 2 conference in the American Conference. Tennessee will survive their relegation scare after being one of the top teams in the conference in the preseason. So now looking at the division leaders. North Carolina beat Louisville last week, which means they will finish at the top of their division for the second year in a row, because they have already beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. The other division is still yet to be decided though. Miami was the one loss that Alabama has, which means that Alabama will need to beat their rival Auburn this week to win the division. Or they could have Miami lose to Clemson in order to win the division for the second season in a row. Miami will need Alabama to lose their game and beat Clemson to claim the division title and face North Carolina. And for the final conference to look at, we will look at the ACC. Cincinnati is going to be the team that will be relegated out of Tier 1 and into the MAC after they lost to Penn State, and West Virginia pulled off the upset over Notre Dame. Ohio State still rules their division and will finish the season against their rival Michigan to try and keep their national title hopes alive for the second season in a row. The other division is a bit more competitive, with 3 teams still with a chance to win it in Michigan, Penn State, and the surprise team, Syracuse, who started these last 3 weeks with a 2-3 conference record and still needed to face Michigan and Penn State. And they were able to win those ones to stay alive going into this last week of the season. However, Michigan will play for the division by facing their rival, Ohio State. If they win that game, they will win the division. If they lose, they will need a Penn State and Syracuse loss to win the division. Penn State plays Michigan State this week and will need to win that game and have Michigan lose in order to win the division. A loss will knock them out of the running. Syracuse will face Cincinnati this week and surprisingly could still win the division with a win over them and a Michigan and Penn State loss because they have the surprising upsets over both of those teams. That could be so fun to see after going 2-3 in their conference to start the season and then going on a roll and finishing the year with huge upsets. So that is how promotion and relegation are looking so far in the season. Still lots of games to play for in week 14 for so many teams trying to stay in their tier and to move up a tier. As a reminder, the teams that will be moving conferences and tiers are BYU, SMU, UCF, and Cincinnati. Miami, Ohio will be moving up, as well as Colorado State. Utah State, Northern Illinois, and Temple are all teams that will be playing for the right to move up tiers. And finally, the last team that will be relegated is the UNLV Rebels, which will be moving down to Tier 4. Thank you so much for watching the Week 14 Promotion and Relegation Show. Catch us next week as we're going to wrap up the season in Week 15. But be sure to tune in to all the massive games that will be played this week with so much on the line. Leave a like if you have enjoyed this series and subscribe if you are new and share it with a friend. And we will see you next week.